I'm Craig Miller, as you already know, and it's my privilege to introduce tonight's guest. Dr. Peter Glick is co-founder and president of the Pacific Institute. He's a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship and was elected both an academician of the International Water Academy in Oslo, Norway, and a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He serves on the boards of numerous journals and organizations and has authored many scientific papers and 9 books. Yes? You
10.
lost count, okay.
10.
Including The World's Water and Bottled and Sold. He is also, as you're about to find out, no shrinking violet. I've interviewed Peter, I think enough times to call him Peter, I think.
Please.
And I've yet to hear him disgorge politically correct or safe talking points. When you talk to Peter, you're going to find out exactly what he thinks, regardless of whose ox might be gored. So with that in mind, please join me in welcoming Peter Glick for a conversation about dry times and our water future here in California and around the world. I'd like to start out talking about a little bit about drought psychology. And I'd like to start with a quote which many Californians can probably recite by heart from John Steinbeck in East of Eden. And the funny thing about this quote is that, just to make sure I got it right, I went and Googled it, and the very first citation that came up was an article you wrote 5 years ago when you invoked this quote. And it never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years, and during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. It was always that way. Now, you'll challenge me on this, but most people would reckon we're 4 years into a drought now. We can come back to that later. You wrote this 5 years ago, and you said that since Steinbeck wrote those words, nothing had changed, really. 5 years fast forward to now, has that changed?
First of all, thank you to the World Affairs Council and for the introduction. I didn't know I was supposed to be goring oxes
we expect that
tonight,
yes.
but we'll see what we can do. Yes and no. Things have changed and things haven't changed. I do think this is a problem with the internet. The fact that Steinbeck didn't come up first is a little disturbing. But nevertheless, the quote that in wet years we forget about the dry years, in dry years we forget about the wet years, that is the psychology of drought. And it's the psychology of drought everywhere. And I don't think that has changed in the sense that if it really starts raining in October, when the rainy season starts, we're going to go back to washing our cars and taking longer showers and giving up some of the drought behaviors that hopefully some of you have adopted over the last 4 years to cut your water use. That's natural. I think that's inevitable. But it has changed in the sense that this drought has been so bad that we've done some permanent things. And maybe we can come back to some of these things, but some of the lawns that are being ripped out and hopefully replaced with beautiful drought-resistant gardens will stay drought-resistant gardens, and we'll never go back to lawns. The washing machine that you buy today is much more efficient than the washing machine you bought 10 or 20 years ago, and it's a permanent change in your water use. You still have clean clothes, but with less energy and water and detergent. So I think we'll see some backsliding when and if the drought ends, but I do think there have been some permanent changes, including at the political level.
In historical terms, as opposed to hysterical terms, because we've heard some of those too, and by historical, I mean, go ahead and include prehistorical if you want, prehistoric, but how bad is this drought?
So that gets to the question about what a drought is. And there are lots of definitions of drought. The one that I like the most is there's not enough water to do what we want. But there's a hydrological drought.
I think we can check that box already with this drought.
And we're there.
Yeah.
By any definition, California's there, although you could argue that even in a wet year in California, we're there.
Yeah.
and again, maybe we'll come back to
Right,
that.
right.
But from a hydrologic point of view, in terms of how much rainfall we get, this is a really bad drought. The last 4 years have been the driest 4 years in California's instrumental record that goes back about 120 years. Now, we actually go back farther than that. There's a field of science called paleoclimatology that evaluates ancient climates. And we get information about ancient climates from tree rings and ice cores and pollen records and all sorts of things. And in California, there is some evidence going back thousands of years about the severity of droughts. And we've had bad droughts in the past, longer droughts.
Multi-decadal.
Multi-decadal shortfalls of average rainfall.
30, 60 years more, right?
And so this isn't necessarily the worst hydrologic drought that the state has ever experienced. But 1,000 years ago, we weren't around, and we didn't have industry, and we didn't have 38 million people. So it gets back to my first definition, not having enough water to do what we want. And by that definition, I would argue this is the worst drought on record. And there's a temperature component to that as well.
Right.
This has not only been the driest 4 years in the instrumental record, it's been the hottest, by far the hottest.
And we're on track for this year to become
And this year,
fall right in line with that.
this year is going to be nowhere. This year is going to be way above any of the last 120 years in terms of temperature, and temperature affects water demand and water availability and evaporation from reservoirs and how much water your lawn uses or your nice drought-resistant garden. So it's bad.
There was a study that caught a little bit of flack. I think largely because it was misunderstood. Came out of Columbia University, Lamont Doherty Observatory, where I believe was the one where they said they were looking for that link to climate change with this drought, and they came to the conclusion that climate change was not the primary driver of this drought. A lot of people jumped on them for saying, well, what about temperature, And of course, they never denied that, yeah, right, you were one of them. So temperature, I mean, let's be clear about that. Temperatures exacerbate droughts, but do you think beyond that, though, that this is a new normal, what are the fingerprints on this from climate change? Do you think?
So there's a confusion about the role that climate change plays in extreme events. And let me start by saying the climate's changing. It's changing because of human activities. That's, in the scientific community, we know that as much as we know that smoking causes cancer. That's not, I would argue, up for debate. The role that climate change plays in extreme events, droughts, floods, hurricanes, is much more complicated. And there's a confusion between causality and influence, i.e., is the current drought caused by climate change, or is it influenced by climate change? And we can't say that the current drought was caused by climate change. We have droughts and floods naturally in California and everywhere around the world. That's actually a really interesting science question right now, and lots of people are working on causality questions. But I think we can say unambiguously that climate change has influenced the current drought, and it's this temperature question. The temperature on the planet is going up, and it's going up because of climate change caused by greenhouse gases that humans have emitted. That's the primary signal of human-caused climate change, and we see it in California. So the higher temperatures that we see in California, which are caused by human-caused climate change, have influenced the severity of the drought, and that's the way I would characterize it. This drought has been made worse by climate change. Whether or not it was caused by climate change, I sort of think is a misleading. I don't think we need to answer that question, and when we can't at the moment.
But you do think that, I take it that we're getting a sneak preview of some new normal. That will come about as a result of climate change.
Yes, absolutely. So climate change is going to get worse. Temperatures are going to continue to go up. There will be changes in precipitation patterns and storm patterns, and we're learning more and more about those risks for California. Any future drought naturally caused will be worsened by higher temperatures, and maybe much more worsened by changes in storm patterns off the Pacific. There's still lots of uncertainties around climate change, but we're in a new normal. Unfortunately, the new normal is changing constantly.
Yeah.
As climate change
As
gets
we
worse and
speak.
worse. There will be more influence on California's everything: coast, agriculture, water systems, heat, stress, all of the things that climate affects, which is pretty much everything.
You said we didn't have 38 million people in California 1,000 years ago when we were having, 60-year droughts. We didn't have 38 million people in California when we built out the plumbing system that we now depend on to get our water to us. And so I want to maybe move into like where we go from here. I promise not to drop quotes all night, but I thought this was another good one from Lester Snow on an op-ed piece in the Sacramento Bee. Lester Snow was formerly, one of the state's top water managers, if you will, and now runs the California Water Foundation. He wrote, "California's biggest problem is not the drought. The real problem is what the drought has exposed, the fundamental weaknesses in how we manage water in the state. Without major and permanent changes now, no amount of rain this winter will fix the situation for the long term." It seems to me there's this disconnect also in California, maybe more so than other places around the country, between people and their water. There aren't that many places where you can just drive out to the edge of town and there's the reservoir and you can see how we're doing. The water comes from so far away for so many of us that I think it's really hard to conceptualize how bad things are. So where do we go from here?
Unless you're a farmer in the Central Valley or a fish in the Delta.
Right.
It's easier for them. We turn on our taps and the water comes out. And hopefully will continue to come out. Very high quality, very cheap, very reliable water. I think
Too cheap?
Oh, definitely too cheap. Way too cheap for everybody. And that fact, that infrastructure that we built that lets a 38 million population thrive, which is the reality.
Or get by, at least, for the moment.
Yeah, mostly thrive. Not everybody equally. That's the advantage of that infrastructure. It's given us a buffer from these natural hydrologic events, a buffer from floods, a buffer from droughts. And it's only the really bad ones that make us begin to rethink the infrastructure and our behavior and policy and so on. In some ways, if there's a silver lining to the drought, it has to some degree raised more awareness about the severity of our water problems in general than otherwise, when we sort of just muddle through, and we go about our lives and we don't think about we don't think about that infrastructure.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
And so that's right.
Yeah.
So if there's an upside, it's a growing awareness. And look, you're all here because I think you probably care about water. And I think people in general care about water, and that the drought has raised a lot of awareness that I think we didn't have.
So what is Peter Glick's three-point program for building long-term resilience, drought resilience, and water security into California? Okay,
so it's 4 or 5 points. Do I have to stop at 3?
I'm editing you already.
So first, let's step back for a minute and think, what do we want? We want a healthy economy. We want a strong agricultural sector. California is a fantastic place to grow food. We want a healthy environment. One of the wonders of California is the unbelievable ecosystems that surround us. All of those things require water. But figuring out how to get what we want with the water system that we have and the water that nature gives us is sort of the question. And if that's the question, then the answer that I and the Pacific Institute and my colleagues think about all the time is thinking about how to use the water that we have as efficiently and carefully as possible. We've spent billions and billions of dollars building infrastructure, building the system that brings water to San Francisco or the East Bay or Los Angeles or the farms in the Central Valley. That's a lot of money that we spent. And if we use water wastefully, that's bad. And so use the water as efficiently as possible. That's the first, our first response, because we've already spent a lot of money to collect it. The second is think about new supply, but not in the traditional sense. The traditional approach to California water policy is build another dam.
Pour concrete.
Drill another groundwater well and suck more groundwater out. Find the next river over and build a pipeline to it. And that brought big advantages to us. That's the system we have today. But we argue that the options for new traditional supply are really, really limited. And that new supply in the traditional sense isn't going to help us. That's not going to get us out of our problem. But that doesn't mean there aren't new supply options. We produce a huge amount of wastewater, all of us. And we've, again, built a lot of infrastructure to collect that wastewater, to treat it to a pretty high standard, and then we throw it away. 5 million acre feet or so a year, or more, into the Pacific Ocean.
An acre foot is a football field covered with a foot of water,
So
or about enough for about how many households?
So an acre foot is an acre covered to a depth of a foot. It's 326,000 gallons. It's what, I always get this wrong. I may have to ask.
I've heard that it's about what a typical household or two households in California would use in a year.
So it's about 2 households inefficiently
okay.
in a year.
All right.
We could probably get 4. We could probably satisfy 4 or 5 or 6 households with an acre foot if we were really efficient.
So how many?
But that's about
how
right.
many million of those did you just?
So we throw 5 million acre feet a year or so of treated wastewater into the ocean. And there's a really interesting conversation going on statewide about using reclaimed, recycled water. We can treat it to any standard, including potable standards, and we do in some places. Or we could use it for groundwater recharge or restoring ecosystems or cooling power plants or landscape watering. I mean, there are lots of things we could use it for. The point is it's another source of supply that doesn't require, look, it's water we've already captured and treated. It doesn't require a new reservoir. It doesn't require draining another river or making the delta smelt go
And it
extinct.
seems like that's in motion to start doing more of that in California now.
It's in motion, but at the moment we use about 13 or 14 or 15% of our wastewater. Israel uses 75% of its wastewater. So we have a lot more potential, and that's a new source of supply.
Well, you've given me a great segue here. I want to remind the audience to fill out those question cards because your turn is coming. But does it seem odd to you that California, being a leader in so many areas of technology, it seems like water's almost an exception to that, like we're almost a laggard in that sense compared to some of these other water-stressed places around there, like Israel, like Australia, some of which have had, been schooled, in the school of hard knocks, like Australia's 10-year drought that they endured. But does it seem like we're running a little behind the pack on this?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, in that there are technologies and policies that California has been very slow to adopt that would help us. No, in the sense that California has been a leader in a number of ways. Appliance efficiency standards, both on the energy side and the water side. We had in the nation the first toilet efficiency standards, 3.5 gallon per flush initially in the late 70s, early 80s, 1.6 gallons, now 1.28 gallons per flush. We had the first statewide washing machine efficiency standards, or one of them, standards that ultimately became national standards. So we led the way in those areas. The Orange County Water Recycling Plant is a state-of-the-art plant, and it's been online for a long time. Orange County's been a leader in that area. I think California has done a good job in some areas and a bad job in other areas, and we could do a better job in almost every area.
You and I were both at the Governor's Water Tech Summit recently, and I lied. Actually, there's one more quote I'm going to drop, and it's from you at that summit, where you said something like, California's water problems won't be solved without technology, but they won't be solved with only technology. You want to amplify on that?
Yes. We love technology, most of us, almost all of us. We love the idea that there's a silver bullet out there. Desalination. Look, there's the Pacific Ocean, 97% of the water on the planet's salt water. If we could just take salt out, and we can, wouldn't that be a solution? And it's a technological solution.
And it's probably one of the most common questions we get at
and
KQED is, why aren't we doing more desal?
Yes, and the answer's on the Pacific Institute's website.
Money.
Money and energy and environment, and they're cheaper, faster, easier things to do.
You end up with some very expensive water at the end of the process.
Yeah, the answer is not that we can't desalinate. It's that there are other things, this is what we argue, that we ought to do first. You do the smarter things first. And the smarter things are water use efficiency, which is cheaper and faster and is saving water that we already have treated and provided. Stormwater capture, reuse. We did a report at the Institute a year ago called Untapped Potential. It's on our website. Untapped potential.
Visual aid.
Looking at the potential
radio
statewide for urban and agricultural efficiency improvements, stormwater capture, wastewater treatment, and reuse. And the answer is there are millions and millions of acre feet of water in those options, which are alternative supply, better demand management, that are cheaper and faster than desalination. And I actually think we'll get to desalination in the long run.
That's a technology that's evolving.
But desalination has economic and political and environmental challenges like lots of options. And so when I say technology is necessary but not sufficient, that's what I mean. There's lots of brilliant new technology out there, but again, if you've lived in California for more than a few days, you know that water is a political issue. It's an economic issue. It's not just a technology issue, and that's really what I was.
Yeah, and one of those non-technological aspects of this is just recently California became the last Western state to finally move toward tracking, not even restricting, but tracking the pumping of groundwater.
And it's going to be decades before that's fully implemented. But yes, we were the last state, so this, from a laggard point of view, we were the last state to have any sort of groundwater law. And 2 years ago, I would not have guessed that we would ever have groundwater law, because there are very strong political reasons for some people in California not to have any groundwater regulation. Some people benefit from that lack of regulation. But the drought, coming back to the drought, did change the politics around that. And last year, the legislature, with support of water organizations that would not have previously supported it, with support of the governor, we passed for the first time, some basic groundwater law.
I think even the people who wrote that thing were surprised that it actually happened.
The stars aligned.
Yeah,
Politically.
Well, it is a first step. Maybe we should talk a little bit about this groundwater, because it's the great invisible reservoir for California. I mean, and that's the problem. It's out of sight and out of mind to most people. As you say, unless you're a farmer sticking a straw in the ground, because your surface water's just been cut off. But this is a hugely important aspect of California's water future, isn't it?
Hugely important, and probably the biggest unresolved issue still is groundwater. Even in a good year in California, we overpump groundwater. That means we use it faster than nature recharges it. And mostly in the Central Valley and mostly in the southern part of the Central Valley, and groundwater levels are dropping. And during a drought, when surface supplies are low, as they are now, and the federal and state projects cut back and farmers are farmers don't get the surface water they need and want, they turn to groundwater. And so during the drought, we're grossly overpumping groundwater, and land is subsiding, and I think that's figuring that we still have not figured that one out, even with the groundwater law, which is requiring us over time to measure and monitor groundwater in basins where it's overdrafted to slowly bring it back into balance. It's going to be decades, unless the drought continues, and then it's going to be it's already a crisis, but then it's going to be a real crisis.
We kind of started down this road a couple of minutes ago, but what do you think is maybe the single greatest lesson that California can learn from elsewhere in terms of securing its water future?
Well, so there are lots of lessons. We started down this road a minute ago. There are lots of things going on there are lots of worldwide water problems. We're not unique. To some degree, almost every water problem you see worldwide, we have an example of in California. Similarly, there are lessons to be learned around the world. I mentioned Israel. Israel is recycling and reusing 75% or so of their wastewater. Israel restructured its agriculture a long time ago in ways that we have still not tackled. Singapore has a very strong water recycling program and water conservation and efficiency program. They also have a state-of-the-art big desalination program, but they've done the water conservation and efficiency and recycling stuff first. There are examples of smart water policies and pricing of water in other parts of the world that we could learn from.
Water markets.
Water markets.
Yeah.
Although that's complicated by California's water rights laws.
Yes.
But water
which
markets
are being tested as we speak also.
So I didn't give a complete answer to your other question when you asked the three things that we might do. Smart economics is another piece of that. The pricing of water markets where they're appropriate. There are problems with water markets. For example, the natural environment doesn't have any money. And so if we went to a pure market system, not that there is such a thing as a pure market system, how do you protect the environment? But smart economics, we don't apply economic tools in California as well as we ought to, is another piece of that puzzle.
We talk about water, have talked about water in the past as kind of the new oil. Do you think that the forces we're seeing right now will put more pressure on privatizing water in the future, or push the pendulum in the other direction? And do you kind of care where that comes down?
I do care. The Institute's done a lot of work on the issue of privatization around water, actually a decade or so ago, because a decade or so ago there was a bigger debate than there is today about water privatization. And water privatization means a lot of different things. Bottled water is a form of privatization. Private water agencies instead of public water utilities is a form of privatization. And in California, 20% of our water agencies are private and 80% are public. Nationwide, it's about 85% are public and 15% are private. But about a decade ago or so, there was a trend toward privatization. People felt, and this is a little more true outside of California and outside of the US than in the US, governments in developing countries had been a failure at providing basic water for their people. And the private sector could bring capital, could bring expertise. So there were a lot of privatization efforts worldwide. And it produced a political response, a negative political response. There were some high-profile failures. There was some pushback. It turned out the public opposition to privatization helped slow that trend, but also economically, it wasn't a big success. It turns out that a really well-run public water agency can provide the same or better service than a well-run private water agency. The trick is not public or private, the trick is well-run. And so a lot of utilities, public utilities in the US, when they saw this privatization trend, said, okay, maybe I better improve my own operations. And that sort of reduced the pressure on privatization.
I'm going to start to take some audience questions, and one of them goes right to something you just mentioned, which was you mentioned that Israel had, quote, restructured agriculture, which was intriguing to me.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions we got is, how is California and the U.S. partnering with Israel, if they are, to make use of Israel's success in making the desert bloom?
Well, there are success story lessons to be learned. That I think there's been a lot of sharing of information. There's a lot of sharing of technology. Some of the best drip irrigation companies in the world are Israeli, and California farmers have learned from that experience. In terms of restructuring, and this may be where oxes start to get gored, the work that the Pacific Institute has done in the agricultural area is really focused on two things. Trying to understand the potential for improving agricultural water use efficiency, by which I mean growing more food with less water, or the same amount of water. That's a technology question. It's a drip irrigation instead of flood irrigation technology. We've stayed away from, and the other piece of that is success stories. We work with farmers that are doing innovative things, and we have a series of farm water success stories on our website that describe some of the really brilliant things that farmers around the state are doing, some farmers around the state. We've stayed away from the question of crop type, what farmers choose to grow.
Right.
And we've stayed away from the question about how much land really ought to be in cultivation in California.
And you've stayed away from that. Why?
In part because we saw the enormous potential for improving efficiency. In part because farmers, completely understandably, don't want to be told what to grow. They grow what they know how to grow, or what the equipment in their barn supports that they've just spent $100,000 on, or what their soils support. And so from our perspective, the first thing is get the signals right. Farmers respond to signals, prices, incentives. And so that's a little outside of what we do at the Institute, but there is a conversation to be had about agricultural policy in the state that farmers themselves are beginning to have about what kinds of crops to grow. So we grow a lot less cotton today than we grew 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
A lot less.
Yeah.
There were a couple of 100,000 acres of cotton cultivation 10 years ago in California, and now it's
I think there were more than
50,000
a million in the 90s. There were more than it was a huge number.
And that's not because of any policy the state implemented. It's because farmers respond over time to the price of cotton and to the price of water and to all sorts of things. And so I think that conversation is starting to happen, but at a different level.
I think it's about 1/10 as much cotton as we were growing in the 90s. Actually,
Yeah.
some numbers I've seen
And
recently.
there are questions about rice cultivation and lower valued crops. It's of course raised all sorts of questions about almonds now, because we're not growing cotton, but we're growing a lot of almonds. Well, we're growing a lot of almonds because farmers make a lot of money growing almonds, and it's a great crop from a nutritional point of view.
It's a bit of a vicious cycle. Is the more dear water becomes, the more farmers have to shift to what they call high margin, higher profit crops, and so they fallow more row crops, plant more almond orchards, which require year-round watering. And so water becomes more dear, so they have to plant more high-value crops. And I mean, is this a little bit of a vicious cycle?
There have been some unintended consequences of some of these things, one of which is a great expansion of permanent crop acreage. You can fallow alfalfa if you don't have the water. If you have an investment in trees, fruit trees, nut trees, whatever, not just I'm not picking on almonds.
You got to water them year-round.
You have to water them. You cannot let those trees die, or you lose a serious investment, and that's a policy question also.
Speaking of price signals, which you were, Here's a question from an audience member who apparently works for one of our water agencies, EBMUD, East Bay Municipal Utility District.
My water agency.
Your water agency. Wants to know, what governance mode do you recommend to finance water agency operational costs? This is an interesting question because it's another one of these conundrums we seem to have in California, where the way things are structured now, water agencies lose money when you conserve. And so it puts them in a weird position to have to put up billboards and launch big public awareness programs, try to get people to conserve more water when they know it's going to hurt their bottom line. What do we do about that?
So that's part of this smart economics conversation. Water utilities provide a service to us. They provide incredibly low-cost, reliable water. Most utilities take away our wastewater magically. It's wonderful. And they charge for that service. Their revenue depends on largely the volume of water that we buy. And during a drought, as you point out, and as I think the questioner is raising, they sell less water. They need to sell less water because there's pressure on water agencies to cut back, on all of us to cut back. That cuts their revenues. That's a rate design problem. And again, I hate to keep pointing you to the Pacific Institute website, but we've done quite a bit of work.
Your time.
The water staff at the Institute have looked at the issue of water rates and pricing. There are rate designs that are smarter than some of the rate designs we have in some of our agencies that help protect revenues for water agencies, but still encourage conservation. You know, we did this in the energy world. We learned how to incentivize energy conservation and protect energy utilities.
They call it decoupling.
They call it decoupling, and we could do a better job of decoupling sales from these kinds of revenue and security questions from an economic point of view. And water utilities could build reserves during good years and use those reserves during drought years. There are lots of mechanisms, lots of rate designs that can get around that problem, but not all of our water agencies have implemented those kinds of reforms yet.
I knew this one was coming. What about fracking and all the water it contaminates? There should be a law, says the questioner.
There should be a law.
There ought to be a law.
There are some laws. So some background.
Yeah.
So fracking, for those of you not familiar with it, is a method for extracting oil or gas from the ground.
It seems lately, kind of almost become synonymous with drilling, though. People kind of use it very generally, almost synonymously, I think, with just drilling.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same.
No, it's not the same.
We've done oil and gas extraction in California for many, many years, for a century. We're a big oil and gas producer. Mm-hmm. There's very little fracking done in California. It's a method for improving the ability to extract oil and gas, and it's really useful for certain kinds of geological formations. It's been used extensively in Pennsylvania, in North Dakota, mm-hmm. In Texas, in Wyoming, and this is a savvy crowd. You've read about it.
And the state of California just put out a long-awaited report on mm-hmm. this. And your institute participated in this. So you said you wrote the section essentially on the water implications. What did you find?
Yes, the water program at the institute was heavily involved in the report that just came out last week. Organized by the California Council on Science and Technology and Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and the institute played a role looking at the science of what we know, what we don't know, what we might do about fracking, water risks, seismic risks, air quality risks, community risks. It's a big report, 2,000 pages or more, and the Institute was involved in the water piece of this.
What's the verdict?
There are serious risks associated with fracking, which is probably no surprise to anybody here, and very serious water-related risks. In California, at the moment, less a water quantity risk than a water quality risk. And the nature of those risks also in part depends on whether there's a big expansion in fracking. Again, we do a little bit of fracking now in California. It's not a huge thing, but if there's a big expansion, which some have called for, then the risks go up enormously. And from a water perspective, a lot of the fracking is done in places where water is short already, the southern San Joaquin and the Central Valley, where a lot of the oil and gas is. So there is a water quantity risk if there was an expansion. But the biggest risks are waste. Let me back up for 1 second. Another part of the oil and gas process is that a lot of what comes back up the wells isn't oil or gas, it's water.
The wastewater.
It's what we call produced water.
Produced water.
And you have to dispose of it. And we dispose of it by, around the country, by re-injecting it in deep wells, or by putting it in pits, or by treating it and putting it to use. And we do all of those things in California. One of the things this study revealed was that a lot of the produced water disposal in California, fracked wells or not, go into pits, surface pits. Some of those pits are unlined. That's a really, 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 really bad idea.
I think that was 4 or 5 reallys there. So
That's because it's a really bad idea. Many states have banned surface disposal in pits of frack. This stuff has chemicals in it. We don't really know what's in it. It's a risk to groundwater. And there are other risks to groundwater. We re-inject into deep wells, but sometimes through groundwater aquifers that we either use or might use for other purposes that are sometimes pretty high quality groundwater. So there are serious groundwater risks, and the state does not adequately protect against contamination.
yeah, I mean, there's always risks. I mean, the question is, are the benefits worth those risks?
Yes, and are the risks adequately regulated and monitored and managed? And the answer is no. We don't adequately regulate or monitor those risks. So there are recommendations in this report. It's a really good report about what we know, what we don't know, what the state of regulations is. There aren't a lot of recommendations, specific recommendations, but one of them is either stop disposing of either ensure that the stuff that goes into these pits is pure water, is safe water, which is pretty unlikely, or don't dispose of it in pits. And one of the immediate responses has been, I think there's going to be some legislation to ban disposal of this stuff in these pits. So that's a big question you've asked.
There are a lot of big questions. We could do 2 hours.
But these were the report. It's available on the CCST, California Council of Science and Technology website. There's a great executive summary. If you're interested in the fracking question, take a look.
We have a very engaged group here. We got a lot of questions, good ones, and I know we're not going to get to all of the question cards before our time is up. But members of the audience, if you're just really worried that we're not going to get to yours, we have 2 microphones here, and any time now, if you'd like to step up to one of those microphones, we'll start recognizing some live questions from the audience as well. We were talking about aquifers before. Is there a point where overpumping can collapse an aquifer beyond repair?
Yes. So sometimes we pump groundwater and the groundwater levels drop, and then you can refill those aquifers, either naturally over time if you have a wet year, or, and this is a really good idea, artificially, by in wet years capturing surface water and recharging those aquifers. And a key strategy in the long run for California water is doing a better job at managing those aquifers. But depending on the geology, sometimes if you overpump groundwater, the land subsides. There's some classic photos from the 20s and 30s and 40s in California of 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet subsidence in the Central Valley from overdrafted. This isn't a new problem, where groundwater land levels have literally dropped 20, 30, 40 feet. And today, we're seeing some subsidence again in the southern part of the San Joaquin because of massive overdraft of groundwater. And when land subsides, that's permanent. You can't reinflate the balloon, if you will. So part of our challenge is a science challenge of understanding groundwater aquifers better and not really badly overdrafting the ones that are vulnerable to that kind of permanent damage.
I knew this was going to come up as well. At least two questioners want to know about the governor's proposed tunnel or tunnels through the Delta. This is another thing. It almost takes, some substantial background, to kind of explain even what these things are and what they're for. What the short version is, basically, that for the health of the Delta, I guess they want to try to more directly divert water from the Sacramento River, about 35 miles underground, to a point where it would come up and be near the pumps to be exported further south. A good idea, bad idea?
Yes. The Delta.
I promised them you wouldn't do that. You remember?
Really?
Yes. You can't take both sides.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. These are complicated issues.
Of course.
This is actually an important point. There's a lot of ideology in our world these days.
Yeah.
And it's a very rare issue, water or not, that has a simple answer. These are complicated questions. The Delta, which is where the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River join, is the heart of, in many ways, of California's water system. Most of the water we pump from Northern California comes out of the Delta, the southern part of the Delta, to the Central Valley Project. The State Water Project goes to the cities in Southern California, and in Northern California, it's in many ways the heart of that infrastructure.
It's the switching yard
that we built, and it's broken. Ecosystems are collapsing. We take too much water out of the Delta. The levees that help direct the flow are vulnerable to earthquakes and subsidence and sea level rise from climate change. Everybody agrees we need to somehow fix the Delta. That's sort of where the agreement ends, because then the question is how. And one of the solutions that has been proposed is these tunnels.
And not for the first time.
We know that the vast amount of water we pump out of the southern part of the Delta is hurting the Delta. It's unreliable. There are water quality problems, and the governor and others have proposed these tunnels to improve our ability to take water out of the Delta. I don't actually have I don't have an official position about the tunnels.
Okay.
The Delta's broken. We have to do something. I think the current design, and this is partly a technical question and it's partly a policy question, the design will permit us to take a lot of water out of the Delta. And I would argue we take too much already out of the Delta. But partly that's a question about policy. How will the tunnels, if they ever get built, be operated? If we build those tunnels and operate them the way I might like them to be operated, that might be okay. But the way that I would probably like them to be operated would deliver less water than I think some of the people who get water out of the Delta would like. So no one's going to give me the keys to the tunnel.
Well, Senator, or now Congressman rather, John Garamendi has publicly fretted about this often. That if you actually build them to the spec size, and then that somebody's going to want to use them to capacity. You don't build them, big and then say, but we're only going to use a little bit of them. There's a lot of concern that if you build them that big, that capacity is going to be used at some point. And that would be too much water.
So there are two other problems.
Yeah.
One is money. These tunnels, I don't know what they're going to cost, but and nobody else does either. But we're talking 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. We've never built any kind of infrastructure on time.
Does that
and
include the
under budget.
financing costs?
Well, maybe.
Okay.
The number that you typically hear, 13 billion, 15 billion, does not include the financing cost. Right. So what's it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? So that's one problem. The other problem is a policy process problem. When this was originally proposed, the idea was we would build these tunnels and fix the ecosystem simultaneously. And that was a condition, partly to get the environmental community to support the idea. And in the last 6 months or so, that promise has been okay, broken. They've separated the ecosystem restoration part from the infrastructure construction part. And I'm a little worried now that we might get one without the other. And because the ecosystem problems in the Delta are so severe, I don't think we can afford to divorce those things. And that's the process debate that's going on now.
Here's another audience question. Many say that in the coming century, countries will fight wars for water. What's your perspective on that?
The Institute has looked for many, many years at conflicts over water. We have, if you're interested in history, as I am, I'm a scientist by training, but I love history. There's something called the Water Conflict Chronology that we coordinate. That's a database of conflicts over water going back 4,500 years into ancient Mesopotamia and legends and history and myth. We fight over water, and that risk, the risk of conflicts over water, I think is growing. I don't really love the water war kind of framing. We fight wars for a lot of different reasons, and rarely any one reason. Economics, borders, religion, ideology, you know, resources sometimes. Water is a component in conflict, and I think tensions over water are growing. I think the risk of violent conflict over water is growing. I wrote a paper a year ago about the connection between climate change and drought and water management in Syria and the conflict in Syria. And I think water management played a role in that conflict. It was not the cause of the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, but I think it played a role. And I think that's the way to think about it. And I think those risks are growing, and we need to get better at figuring out how to reduce the role that water may play in those kinds of conflicts.
And this is a related question, and I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but there's this bundle of solutions we're talking about for the world's water problems going to be able to keep up with the rising population? We're talking about, what, 9 billion people not long from now.
So I don't want to leave the impression that I don't believe we need to build more water infrastructure. We do, especially in other parts of the world. There are other parts of the world that desperately need some of the water infrastructure that we have, that we built, for flood protection, for drought relief, for urban supply, for water treatment, for wastewater treatment. So I've written about what I call a soft path for water, which is a combination of smart infrastructure and smart economics and demand management and better institutions. I do think those things combined in different ways in different parts of the world, depending on the nature of the problem, can solve our water problems. But it's also true that our water problems, and I would argue all of our problems, are more difficult with a growing population. Population is a piece of this puzzle, an important piece of this puzzle. The good news, if there's good news on the population side, is that I think the world's population is going to level off and then start to go down. I think in my children's lifetime that's going to happen. It's 7+ billion now. It's going to go to 8. It's going to go to 9. I don't know if it's going to go to 10. That partly depends on what we do on the population side. But I think it's going to level off, and then it's going to start to go down. And if we can keep it together, if you will, until then the nature of our problems changes. The nature of our energy problems change. The nature of our water problems change. And I do think that the things that I've been talking about, smart technology, smart water policy, can help us get to the point where maybe we can take population out of the equation. And it's a couple of decades off, but that's going to be a remarkable day when population globally starts to decline.
Another questioner puts kind of the same question a different way. Access to water has been designated as a human right by the United Nations. Is that a promise we can keep?
So I'm glad somebody asked that question. I've sort of thought about it, and then it fled my mind instantly when you asked about privatization. Water's an economic good. We pay for it, or we pay for the services that we require. But water is also a human right, and that's a conflict. It's a tension. In 2010, the UN declared a human right to water, and the Institute played a role in the debate about the human right to water. And they didn't say you shouldn't price water or charge for water. They didn't say that we shouldn't discuss privatization as a model for water systems. They said water's a human right. You cannot deny somebody water for political purposes, and countries and water agencies and non-governmental organizations have to work progressively to ensure that everyone worldwide has access to safe water and sanitation. It's water and sanitation are human rights. And I think that's right. And the way we provide that right and enforce that right is part of the challenge. There are responsibilities of governments. There are principles that the human right to water implies and mean for governments and for corporations and for individuals. I think that's an interesting conversation. In fact, California then subsequently passed a law that said there's a human right to water. And we're sort of trying to figure out what that means.
What to do with that.
What to do with that.
Right, right.
But there are populations in the Central Valley that don't have access to safe drinking water. This isn't just a worldwide developing country problem. There are populations in California drinking water contaminated with nitrates beyond the level that we know is safe. And we've known that for a decade, and we haven't fixed that problem, which is unconscionable, in my opinion. It's not a technology problem. That's a policy institutional problem.
We want to come back to the drought, but I feel duty bound as a journalist to ask you about this. I gather that you and the guys from the Heartland Institute don't get together for golf outings or anything like that. But for the uninitiated, it was about 3 years ago, I guess. There was a kerfuffle, to put it mildly, when Peter Glick took on this, I guess they would call themselves a think tank. You might describe them differently.
I might.
But they've been at the forefront of shall we say, questioning climate science, and have put a lot of money into that effort. And basically, what it comes down to is these guys got your goat, because we know you don't suffer climate deniers gladly, and you exposed some of their motives in operations, by getting a hold of some of their documents and putting them out there on the internet, first anonymously. Later, you kind of came out and said it was you who'd done it. They expressed outrage, of course, and they said they were going to sue you, and they said you should be in jail. And that episode, you've already expressed regrets publicly about the way you went about this. But I'm just wondering, first of all, it doesn't seem to have slowed you down any. You're still director of the Pacific, still the head of the Pacific Institute. I guess my question is, with 3 years worth of hindsight on this episode, what do you take away from that?
Okay, so I said earlier that the science of climate change is extraordinarily strong. There are lots of interesting scientific questions about climate change, but it's strong, really strong. At the same time, there's been a decades-long effort on the part of a small number of well-funded organizations to deny that science, to say that the science isn't as strong as it is, to misuse that science. Organizations funded by largely dark money because of the way our system works. And a kerfluffle is a sort of a polite way to put it. But 3 years ago, I got involved in a little bit of a confrontation. I was sent some documents, and then I obtained some documents from the Heartland Institute that described their climate strategy and some of their funders and their payments to climate deniers.
And we should say, if we didn't before, that you obtained these documents by misrepresenting who you were. They thought they were sending them to some other guy, right? And that was intentional.
Yes. Yes. Some of the methods that I used to obtain those documents were controversial.
Which is also a polite way of putting it.
And I apologized actually right away. When I sent the documents to journalists. I wrote a piece about this on Huffington Post, which is still there if you're interested. And I apologized for the methods that I used. But I do not apologize for working to defend climate science. I'm a scientist by training. But I'm a scientist that believes in the public process, the importance of the role of science in the public arena. And I'm a parent, and I'm a citizen, and I'm a human being. And I see the threat of climate change as an existential one, a threat to the planet. And I'm not going to stop working on science, and I'm not going to stop working on public communications. And I'm not going to apologize for that role that I play.
With a couple minutes that we have left, let's go back to the drought and just finish with this one. Also an audience question, but it was one of mine too. What happens if we have another year of this in California? And it's not just California now. It's of course it's the Pacific Northwest. But what happens specifically to California if we have a fifth year of this?
Lots of things happen, although my crystal ball is not any clearer than yours. But the conversation will continue. We'll have a conversation about technology. Maybe we'll have some of these conversations about agricultural reform.
Conflicts escalate?
Tensions, absolutely. Conflicts will escalate. We're already seeing, it's simplistic, but some people talk about it's farms versus cities versus the environment. That's
it's an oversimplification.
That's a huge oversimplification. There are tensions within our cities about how individuals use water. There are tensions from farmers that have senior water rights and junior water rights. There are farmers that grow alfalfa versus farmers that grow almonds. There are different environmental disputes. I think we'll see more conflicts. Hopefully, political conversations. But I also think, just as the last couple of years have provided us with an opportunity to maybe have some conversations we hadn't had before, that we'll have some other kinds of conversations about what we can really do fundamentally to fix California water. Because if it does start raining, we'll forget about the dry years. And some of the potential for reform will evaporate, pardon me. So there's an opportunity, if there's a fifth year, to fix things that we might not otherwise fix, and to make permanent some of the changes that right now may be temporary, and maybe we'll move away from the John Steinbeck philosophy.
Good job. I handed you a lemon, and you made lemonade out of it to finish with. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, join me in thanking Peter Glick for joining us, and thanks to our audience as well.
Thank you.